The rain had slowed to a mist that made the city shine like glass, and Clara Morgan stepped into the restaurant with her heart beating too fast and her palms damp and cold. She had told herself this night was for courage, not for love. She had called a sitter for Lila. She had ironed the one black dress that still fit, and she had promised herself that she would sit at a table for one and breathe and remember she was more than unpaid bills and night shifts. She asked the host for a small table near the back, someplace quiet, and the host nodded and led her past pillars draped in ivy, past candles that flickered like tiny suns, past voices that sounded like secrets and victories and perfect lives, the kind of lives that never seemed to include people like her. She sat and folded the napkin with care and looked at the empty chair across from her and felt the itch to run. She ordered water and held the glass with both hands like it might anchor her. To the moment the room smelled like citrus and rain and roasted herbs. She told herself to notice it, to not disappear into the tight knot of worry that always lived under her ribs. Tonight was practice for a braver life, she whispered to herself without sound. Tonight I am enough at a table for one. Two executives at the bar laughed too loud. A couple near the window leaned close over a single plate. A violinist somewhere on the mezzanine drew a ribbon of sound through the air. Clara closed her eyes and let the note pass through her like a tide. When she opened them, she saw the door swing wide and the room shift just slightly, the way rooms do when weather changes. A man stepped in, tall in a dark coat, the low light catching on his cheekbone like he had been carved from shadow. Adrian Hayes. The name crashed through her like thunder. The CEO of Hayes & Co., the man whose signature could move whole floors of desks, the man whose photo lived on magazine covers, the man who had once stopped a takeover with a single sentence on live television. She had seen him only twice in the building from a distance. He had looked like a lighthouse and a storm at the same time. He was not supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in London or Tokyo or wherever people like that lived when they were not inside glass towers, and yet he was here, shaking rain from his hair and scanning the room with eyes that seemed to know every corner. He had no entourage, no noise. He simply existed, and the space around him rearranged to make room for that fact. He started toward the bar and then stopped because something cut across his path. A woman in a crimson dress, a slash of lipstick, a smile too polished to be kind. Sienna Marlowe. Clara had seen her in trade articles, the rival who circled Hayes & Co. like a hawk. She was ruthless, elegant and hungry. She touched his sleeve too familiarly and the air around them went bright and dangerous. Clara looked down at her hands because it hurt to watch power move that close to the surface. She told herself to sip water, to breathe, to be invisible. Then a shadow fell across her table and a voice, low and precise, said, "Forgive me," and she looked up straight into eyes the color of winter sky. Adrian Hayes did not smile. He only inclined his head a fraction and said, "May I borrow a seat for 2 minutes?" Her mouth forgot how to form words. She managed a small yes, and he slid into the empty chair across from her. The room tilted, the violin paused, then continued as if nothing had happened. He did not look at her. He looked past her toward the bar where Sienna had turned half away to take a call. His voice was quiet enough that only her table could hear. "This will sound strange, and I will owe you for it, but I need you to pretend we are not strangers for exactly 3 minutes." Clara blinked once, twice. The part of her that feared everything began to shout. The part of her that had run through fire for Lila lifted its head and said, "Try." He leaned forward, not closer, only sharper, and said, "She is here to force a story. I would prefer to write my own. Will you help me do that?" Clara nodded, because saying the word might break her. He exhaled the faintest change and his face rearranged into something almost gentle. He placed his hand flat on the table, palm up, not touching, and said, "I am going to stand so the room sees us and come back to you and call you my wife." And then he stood smoothly as if pulled by a string. The coat slipped from his shoulders. A server caught it on reflex. He turned slightly toward the bar as Sienna lifted her gaze again and in a voice that carried like warm thunder said, "Sorry to keep you waiting, my wife." The sound moved through the restaurant like a wave. People turned, a few brows climbed. Cameras in the minds of curious men began to click. Clara felt heat rise to her face like dawn. The word wife settled around her shoulders like a coat that did not belong to her and yet fit. Adrian sat again and the room exhaled. He kept his hand near but not touching, his eyes on hers now, seeing if she would break. She did not. He said, "Thank you," and the thank you did not sound like politeness. It sounded like a promise. The server arrived as if conjured and asked if they would like to see menus. Adrian said, "2 please, and water for both." He did not ask what she wanted. He simply made space for the ordinary shape of a couple and held it steady long enough for the story to look true. Clara found her voice and asked softly, "Why me?" And he said, "Because you are the only person in this room who is not acting like they are." Being watched, Sienna moved closer, her smile ablaze. She stopped at their table and set her clutch down like a flag. Adrian, such a surprise, the board thought you were out of town. And who is this? Clara felt her spine stiffen. Adrian said calmly, my wife, and the word landed between them like iron. Sienna's eyes flicked over Clara, measuring, then dismissing, then returning with a small doubt. How lovely, she said, and the kindness bent at the edges. She added, we should all talk about the proposal tomorrow. The one that will make your shareholders very happy. Adrian said, I read every line. It makes no one happy but you. The violinist leaned into a brighter note. The server poured water. The room listened without seeming to listen. Sienna's smile did not change. She looked at Clara and said, you must be very proud. He is difficult to catch. Clara felt the answer rise from a place in her chest that remembered hunger and fear and nights of rocking a feverish child. She said quietly, he is difficult to misjudge. If you do not look away for the first time. Something like interest touched Sienna's face, then she nodded as if deciding today was not the day and drifted back toward the bar, leaving a trail of perfume and headlines in her wake. Adrian watched her go without moving, then turned back to Clara. The tension that had held him like wire eased one notch. You were perfect, he said. Clara shook her head. I said almost nothing that was the perfection. You did not oversell the truth, you let it exist. He took a sip of water, and the simple act felt like the storm admitting there was a shore. She asked again, more breath than sound. Why me? He considered, and the corners of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. Because you are not performing, because you did not try to claim the light, because when I said wife you did not flinch, you chose to carry the word. Instead a server appeared with menus that she did not remember asking for. Adrian nodded, and the server vanished. Clara stared at the paper and saw nothing but pale lines. He said, order something you can actually eat. You look like a person who forgets to eat. And she almost laughed because it was true, because nights still came when the choice was food for her or formula for Lila, and the choice was not a choice. She said, I will have soup and bread if that is allowed, and he said, everything is allowed at this table. The soup arrived, steam curling like promises, the bread warm enough to burn her fingers. She took a cautious sip and felt her whole body remember what comfort was. She ate in small careful bites, aware of him but not shrinking from it. They did not talk about work. They did not talk about the false marriage hanging in the air between them like a banner. Instead he asked how old, and she said 6, and he said name, and she said Lila, and the room grew softer around those 2 syllables. He asked who is with her now, and she said my neighbor Marisol, the one person who stayed when the world fell. He nodded like he knew the shape of that world. Then the restaurant door opened again, and 2 men in suits with hungry eyes entered, and somewhere behind them a paparazzi flash spidered white across the window like lightning. Adrian's gaze cut that direction and back to her. The plan did not end here. His voice dropped half a degree. I am sorry, but the performance must hold a little longer. They will push, and they will not care who bleeds if we let them. He laid a small black card on the table and slid it toward her. It held a number and a name that was not his. Clara picked it up, and it felt like a key. 2 words in white letters: press liaison call. If anyone waits outside your building, they will disappear. The men in suits approached with smiles that did not reach their eyes. Mr. Hayes, a quick word about the proposal and the rumor, he said. We do not speak of either here. This is a private dinner. They glanced at Clara as if she were furniture. He added, and my wife chooses where and when she speaks. The words wrapped around her again, and this time they did not feel like a costume. They felt like a shield. The men hesitated, measured the room, calculated the optics, and retreated with promises to follow up through channels. Adrian leaned back as if the last invisible thread had finally been cut. He looked at her, not past her, and said, I owe you more than dinner. She said, I do not want money. He said, I did not offer money. I offered a debt. Ask something and keep it for when the day is mean. She almost said, I want a safer life and a door that locks and a world that does not try to swallow my child. But she only said, meet me again tomorrow at lunch and explain what I just helped you stop. He considered, then nodded slowly. Done, and the nod felt like a contract signed by whether. They ate in a quiet that was not awkward, the kind of quiet that happens when 2 people decide not to pretend to be different than they are. When the bill came, the host brought it to Adrian with eyes that glittered with gossip, and he signed without looking. Clara stood, and the dress tugged at her hips, and she remembered she had not worn heels in months. He noticed before she could hide the wobble and said, I will walk you out. This is part of the scene. She wanted to refuse because pride is a habit hard to kill, but the night air outside was sharp and strangers watched for stories, so she let him fall into step beside her. The rain had started again, thin like silk. She could smell the river and the city and the smallest thread of rosemary from the kitchen door. He stopped under the awning and turned to her, and for a moment there were no towers, no negotiations, no headlines, just 2 people linked by a word they had not earned and yet had carried together. He said, tomorrow noon the Atrium Cafe bring nothing but the truth, and she said, I do not have much else. He glanced at the street where a camera lens glinted and added, one more thing, if anyone asks, say the line exactly, and only once. He waited until she met his eyes, then gave it, my husband and I are very happy. The sentence landed between them like a coin dropped into a deep well. It rang once clear and low, then disappeared into the dark. He held her gaze a breath longer than was safe, then stepped back, and the night reclaimed him like tide reclaiming shore. She watched him go until the door closed and the restaurant swallowed his shape. She turned her face into the rain and let it cool the heat in her cheeks. Then she walked fast toward the train with the black card tight in her fist, thinking of Lila asleep under the soft lamp, wondering how a table for one had become a stage and how a stranger had become a shelter. When she reached the apartment, the hallway smell of soap and dust felt almost dear. Marisol cracked the door and whispered, all quiet, little star was a dream. Clara exhaled a stored storm and kissed her neighbor's cheek and stepped into the dim room. She stood over the small bed and watched Lila breathe the soft rise and fall, the proof that tomorrow was worth climbing into. She touched the edge of the blanket and promised a better day out loud to the dark. Then she set the black card on the counter like it talisman, wrote noon in chalk on the fridge, and sat a long time at her own small table, for one that no longer felt lonely but like a beginning. Clara woke before dawn to the sound of rain on the cracked window, and for a moment she thought last night had been a dream, just a fevered story. Her mind had spun to survive the quiet. She shuffled to the kitchen barefoot and poured coffee into the chipped mug. She held the warmth like it could keep her from floating away, and stared at the black card on the counter, the one Adrian had slid toward her like a secret. It felt heavy as stone and as fragile as a wish. She showered, dressed, and whispered to Lila, who slept curled like a comma under her small blanket, Mama will be back soon. And Marisol slipped in quietly with her easy smile and her calm hands and said, go breathe for a while. The city was slick and silver, the tower rising above it like a blade. She walked faster than she meant to through the echoing lobby where voices bounced like coins off marble. She told herself she was not here to be seen, she was here to understand what she had been pulled into. She took the elevator to the Atrium Cafe on the 17th floor. Her badge still worked, which somehow felt like a miracle. The cafe was all glass and green vines suspended from steel beams. The air smelled of espresso and wet leaves. She stood just inside, unsure, and then he was there, Adrian Hayes, at a corner table, sunlight cutting across his shoulders, suit black as ink, posture easy like man who had never once doubted gravity. He did not look up when she approached, but the moment her shadow crossed the table, his eyes lifted sharp and clear as frost, and the corner of his mouth bent almost into a smile. Clara sat because standing felt impossible. He said, you came, and she said, you asked, and he said, people often say yes and still do not arrive. She said, I am not people, and he said, I am beginning to see that. He passed her a small folder, black leather smooth as river stones. She opened it to find photographs, charts, clippings, lists, a lattice of threats, Sienna Marlowe's name threaded through them like a red wire. Acquisition offers, shadow shareholders, leaks to the press. She felt cold crawl up her arms, and he said, she has been circling for 2 years waiting for the board to fracture. Last night she planned to stage a narrative that I was distracted, vulnerable, manipulable. He paused, and the faintest spark of amusement crossed his face. It is harder to paint a man as distracted when he is seen dining with his wife. Clara closed the folder and stared at her hands. They looked like someone else's hands, too thin, too pale, too tired. She said, I was a shield, and he said, you were a mirror. She tried to hand the folder back, and he did not take it. He said, keep it, know what you stood in front of. She slid it into her bag, feeling like it weighed more than bricks. The server brought her tea without asking, and she wondered if Adrian had somehow told them everything with one look. He said, the board is split. Some of them want to believe her, some want to believe me. They will decide by watching who believes me first. I need the world to see certainty. He looked at her, not at the vines or the light or his watch, only at her, and said, they already saw it last night in your face. Clara felt heat rise to her neck. She said, it was not real, and he said, reality is a vote, not a fact. If enough people believe something, it becomes the shape the world bends into. She said, you are asking me to lie, and he said, I am asking you to act like the truth already exists. The words settled like stones. She thought of Lila, small and bright and fragile as hope. She thought of Rent and the cracked window and the way power had moved around Sienna like a storm cloud. She said, what happens if I say no? And he said, then I will thank you for last night, and you will never hear my name again, and the board will hand her the company, and thousands of people will belong to someone who sharpens knives in the dark. She watched the rain streak down the glass behind him, and knew she had already decided. She said, what exactly would I have to do? And his shoulders eased as If some invisible weight had shifted, he said, attend 2 events, speak to no press, wear this, and he slid a velvet box across the table. Inside was a ring, gold, thin and bright. She stared at it like it might bite. She said, this is insane, and he said, that is what makes it work. They planned in low voices while the cafe filled with the hum of morning. Her name would stay hers, her life would stay hers, but for a handful of weeks, she would appear by his side like they belonged to each other. They would sign nothing, but the air would believe they had signed everything, and by the time Sienna realized the walls would have closed around her when they finished, he stood, and so did she, and for a moment the sunlight caught both of them in the glass, and they almost looked like something real. He said, one more thing, this only works if you never flinch, if you look at me like you chose this. Clara said, I did not, and he said, then look at me like you could if. He walked her to the elevator, and the eyes of the building followed like silent wolves. When the doors closed, she let out a breath that felt years old. On the street the rain had stopped, the air smelled washed. She walked home fast, her heart loud. She opened the apartment door to find Lila building a tower of blocks, Marisol humming over the stove. Clara scooped her daughter up and held her close and whispered, we are safe, we are safe, we are safe. Even if it was not true, yet she would make it true. She looked at the velvet box still clutched in her hand and slipped it into her pocket like a spark. She could not let go. The first event was 3 nights later in a ballroom strung with chandeliers like frozen lightning, the kind of place Clara had only seen in magazines, the ceiling painted with angels, the air thick with perfume and ambition. She stood at the top of the marble stairs in a borrowed gown that shimmered like spilled moonlight and tried not to tremble, her hair pinned high, her shoes too tall, her heart slamming. She could feel eyes already sliding over her, calculating, curious and hungry. She gripped the rail and reminded herself she was not prey, she was part of a performance. Then the room shifted like a current turning. Adrien had arrived. He moved through the entrance alone, and yet the space parted for him like tide around stone, the black suit sharp as ink, the cufflinks catching fire from the chandeliers. He did not smile, but the air bent toward him. He saw her, and his expression changed. Almost nothing, just the faint softening around the eyes that looked like recognition. He crossed the room without hurry, and every gaze followed. He stopped before her and said, you look late for the stars. She breathed out slow and said, you look like you built them. He offered his arm. She took it, and they descended into the noise together. People pressed close with questions wrapped in compliments, investors, journalists, executives, old board members with brittle smiles. Adrien answered none of them directly. He moved like someone who had decided where gravity fell, and Clara floated in his wake, playing the part, eyes steady, spine straight. She heard whispers, my wife, as he said it to someone across the table, and the word fell like a stone into a pool, and ripples moved through the crowd. She caught sight of Sienna at the far edge of the room, red dress like a wound, lips curved in a blade of a smile, watching like a predator watching prey. Adrien led Clara to the center table where the photographers waited. Flashes cracked like distant storms. Clara kept her face calm. She thought of Lila stacking blocks and giggling at falling towers. She let the memory steady her. Adrien's hand settled lightly on the small of her back, just enough for the cameras, just enough for her pulse to steady. They posed, they smiled, they moved on. She spoke little, just enough soft words about travel and books, about quiet mornings and children learning to read, the kind of words that made her seem whole and warm and real, the kind of words that made Adrien seemed human. After hours of endless lights, they slipped out through the side garden into cool air and darkness. She kicked off her heels and held them by the straps, her feet screaming. Adrien loosened his tie and said, you did perfectly. She laughed once, sharp and breathless, and said, I said maybe 20 words, and he said, and everyone was gold. He drove her home through streets washed silver by moonlight, the car quiet except for the hum of tires and their breath. She sat watching his reflection in the glass, the clean line of his jaw, the set of his mouth, like he was holding back whole storms. They stopped outside her building, the cracked bricks glowing faint in the streetlight. She said, I am not sure who they think I am anymore. He said, they think you are the kind of woman who could make me stay still for 3 hours, and that is enough. She climbed the stairs on bare feet, the gown swishing like water. Marisol asleep on the couch, Lila sprawled on her blanket, clutching a stuffed fox. Clara stood over her daughter and felt the walls of fear that had caged her heart for years shift just a little. The second event came fast, a board luncheon at the top of the tower, glass on all sides, the skyline cut sharp against blue. Adrien introduced her not as an accessory but as if she had always been written into the structure. The board members stared and blinked, recalibrating their maps. She spoke when spoken to, clear and measured. She watched the balance tilt in the room, the old guard leaning Back the younger ones leaning forward, believing what their eyes showed them more than what their minds whispered. After the meeting they stood alone by the windows, the city spread below like circuitry. She said they almost believe it, and he said they believe what steadies them. You are steadier than you think. She said I feel like I am balancing on smoke, and he said smoke still rises. He reached out and touched her hand only for a second, a small grounding contact, and for the first time since the night in the restaurant she felt the performance blur at the edges. She pulled her hand back, slow, not sudden. He said this will end soon, and she said I know. He said and you will walk away clean, and she said maybe. That night she lay awake long after Lila fell asleep, staring at the ceiling, listening to the radiator, thinking about the way his voice had softened when he said you are steadier than you think, wondering if he had meant the words or if he was simply that good at making people believe in things that did not exist, yet wondering which of them was pretending more and which of them had already stopped. The first crack in the perfect stage came on a Tuesday afternoon when the sky was low and the air pressed heavy against the tower glass. Clara had just finished a strategy session, her mind buzzing with numbers, when her phone lit with a name she had not seen in 2 years. Kyle. She froze, the world tilted. She stepped into the stairwell and answered with hands that shook. He said I heard about your big new life and your rich husband and your little girl. I think it is time I see her again. His voice slick and hollow like oil. She said you left before she could breathe, and he said I changed. People do when there is money involved. Her stomach went cold and sharp. She hung up before he could say more. The call felt like a match in dry grass. She walked through the office with her face still but her pulse a drum. The whispers followed her louder now, headlines about her and Adrian exploding across every screen, stock tickers flaring, Sienna circling like a shark smelling blood. That evening paparazzi clustered outside her building, cameras like teeth. She ducked inside with Lila in her arms, heart pounding, Marisol locking the door behind her. The walls felt thin as paper. Adrian came the next morning, early, dark suit, sharp as armor, his expression cut from stone. She let him in before the neighbors could see. He stood in the kitchen while Lila played on the floor and said I know about Kyle. His voice was low enough to bend steel. She said he is trying to take her, and he said he will not. She said he could. He is her blood, and Adrian said blood is not the same as care. His legal team moved like a shadow net overnight. They dug through old court filings, eviction notices, unpaid debts, abandoned jobs, police reports, a trail of absence that stretched like rot. Adrian stood beside her at the first custody hearing, the courthouse air stale and cold. Kyle smirking across the aisle in a suit that did not quite fit. His lawyer trying to paint Clara as unstable, too wrapped up in her new life to care for a child. They showed photos of Lila smiling and healthy, doctor notes glowing with praise, testimony from Marisol who spoke like iron. The judge watched, stone-faced. Sienna appeared in the gallery, 2 rows back, red lips curved like she was savoring the chaos. Clara felt her throat lock. Adrian glanced once over his shoulder and she melted back into the crowd like smoke. The hearing stretched for hours, long and gray and airless. Kyle's lawyer needled, tried to provoke Clara into snapping, but she stayed still and steady, and when it was over the judge said petition denied, full custody remains with the mother. Gavel down like thunder. Clara exhaled a breath that felt years old. Outside on the courthouse steps the reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, questions slicing. Adrian stepped between them and her without a word, his body a wall. The noise fell back like waves against rock. He put his hand lightly on her back and said go home to her. She nodded, throat tight, climbed into the waiting car. The city blurring past like a dream. That night she sat on the floor with Lila, who was stacking blocks and laughing, the sound bright and whole. Clara felt hollowed out and full all at once. Adrian knocked, and she opened the door without thinking. He stepped inside, quiet as shadow, removed his jacket and sat on the floor in his immaculate shirt while Lila crawled into his lap, tiny hands clutching his tie. He let her tug and giggle, his face softening into something almost human. Clara watched them, and something shifted inside her like ice cracking on a river. After Lila slept they sat on the couch in the dim lamp glow, the city humming far below. She said why are you doing this really? And he was silent a long time, then said when my sister died no one came to stand with me. I will not let that happen to her or to you. His voice was raw, edges showing. She said you do not have to carry us, and he said maybe not, but I want to. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time the mask was gone, and what was left was not the zone, not the storm. Just a man with tired eyes and steady hands, and something in her chest that had been locked for years stirred awake. She said thank you and meant it like a vow, and he nodded once like he had been waiting to hear it all along. Weeks passed, and the city began to feel softer, the sharp edges blunted like glass worn smooth by waves. The story that had begun as a performance had rooted itself in the minds of the world. Clara could feel it every time she walked through the tower lobby, the way people Straighten smiled, nodded, not with suspicion now but with something like belief. The board stopped watching her like a ticking bomb and started asking her opinion in meetings. The younger analysts followed her lead. The older ones stopped trying to talk over her. Her name threaded through project memos and pitch decks like it belonged there. Lila thrived, bright and fierce, climbing furniture, giggling with Marisol in the evenings while Clara cooked real meals again, not just toast and coffee. She bought curtains, she fixed the cracked window, she let herself laugh sometimes when the room was quiet. She caught her reflection and did not see a ghost anymore. She saw someone building. Adrian stayed close, not like a shadow now but like gravity, constant, unseen but shaping everything. He appeared at the daycare pickup carrying Lila on his shoulders while she shrieked with delight. He sat at her kitchen table late at night scrolling through contracts while Clara folded laundry. They talked about everything and nothing. Books she loved as a child, The Shape of Constellations, where he ran when the world got too loud, how they had both learned to survive by becoming harder than they wanted to be. Sienna tried once more to strike, leaking a false report about fraud to the press, but Adrian dismantled it in hours, releasing clean ledgers and quiet threats, and she vanished from the headlines like smoke. Kyle disappeared too after the court ruling, his silence like a door slamming on an old haunted room. One Friday evening the tower hosted a gala to celebrate a new publishing line. The ballroom glittered with gold light and polished glass. Clara stood near the windows wearing a dark blue gown that shimmered like deep water, her hair loose, for once her laugh easy. She could feel eyes on her, but not in the way they used to be, not like knives, more like lanterns. Adrian crossed the room through the noise in a black suit sharp as night and stopped before her as if nothing else existed. He said, "They look at you like you built this place," and she said, "Maybe I am." He smiled, then not the public smile, the real one, small and private and almost shy. He said, "I have to ask you something before the night ends." She said, "What?" And he said, "Not yet, come dance first." They danced slow while the orchestra curled soft notes through the air, his hand steady at her back, her hand against his chest, feeling the heart under the armor. For a moment the whole frantic world fell quiet, like they had stepped outside of time. When the song ended he did not let go. He led her out onto the rooftop garden above the city, the skyline blazing like stars fallen to earth. The wind warm and soft. He turned to her, and for the first time since she had met him his voice trembled. He said, "The night I called you my wife, it was a lie that saved me, but somewhere between then and now it became the truest thing I know. If you want I will make it real." He opened a small velvet box, and inside a ring caught the starlight like fire. Clara felt her heart stutter, the world tilt, the ghost of who she had been that night at the table. For one watching from very far away, she thought of Lila, of every step from fear to this moment, and she said yes, her voice breaking like dawn. He slid the ring onto her finger slow like a vow, and she laughed through the tears, and he pulled her close and kissed her under the endless sky, the city roaring below like applause. Later they walked home hand in hand through quiet streets, Lila asleep on Marisol's shoulder. The future stretched wide before them, not perfect, not certain, but there's Clara tucked Lila into bed and stood at the window looking out at the lights, her ring warm against her skin. Adrian came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and said, "We are not pretending anymore." And she said, "No, we are home." And for the first time in her life the word home felt true.